Sport Business. Global Sports Intelligence.
Hello, and welcome to Inside the Deal, the monthly podcast from Sport Business. My name is Frank Dunne, and I'm the editor-at-large of Sport Business. Now, the idea of this podcast is that each month we take one deal. We have a look at that deal in detail. It's not always going to be the most valuable deal, because we like to think that we can bring you something that you're not going to find elsewhere. So we try to identify deals which we think are interesting, which tell us something about what's happening in the industry. But we always try to identify deals where we're fairly confident that we're bringing you some exclusive information or exclusive insights that you're not going to find anywhere else. Now, this month, we're going to be looking at a deal that wasn't done in the last few days. It's done a good few months ago now, but it's a deal where information has come to light, which we think we would like to share with you. It's the deal between Netflix and FIFA for the Women's World Cups of 2027 and 2031. And I'm delighted to be joined by Maria Kholodova, who is a journalist who recently broke a story providing information about that deal, which wasn't previously in the public domain. So before we get into the details, welcome, Maria. How are you doing, Maria?
I'm good, Frank. I'm good. I was just away on holiday for a couple of days in Bologna, where I saw you. So that was very nice.
Indeed. Enjoyed a cocktail in the old town. Glad you enjoyed it. On the 5th of November, you ran a story in which you broke the value of the deal. That people have been aware of this deal for some time, but I don't think anyone was aware of exactly how much Netflix had paid for the rights to the Women's World Cup. So it's time for the big reveal. How much is it worth, Maria?
So we understand that the overall value of the deal is about $400 million in total for the rights to the 2027 and 2031 Women's World Cups.
And what exactly does Netflix get for its money?
So that $400 million value includes both World Cups 27 and 31, as well as we understand a bonus for when the US is formally awarded the hosting rights in 2031, alongside possibly its CONCACAF neighbors. And the 27 tournament is hosted in Brazil. And then Netflix's deal also includes all matches in both tournaments, both in English and in Spanish. And Netflix has also said that it will produce, quotes, star-studded studio shows and exclusive documentary series kind of in the Netflix style in the lead up to both tournaments, about top players in the women's game, the global growth of the game, and things like that. And we've actually heard from some sources that the overall value might be even higher than $400 million when you include that value in kind from those documentaries and promotions for the tournament. And I should also mention that in August, Netflix announced that they also secured the rights in Canada, but we understand that they're also interested in Brazil, but those rights were recently awarded to Globo and Cazé TV for that home tournament in 27.
So obviously Brazil, in terms of time zone, is a perfectly good location for US broadcasting, for US streamers. What do we know exactly at the moment about the 2031 hosting situation? How nailed on is that?
I think it's essentially dotting the I's and crossing the T's. I think it's, from what we understand, even from when the deal was done, everyone sort of understood that that was where it was heading. I think the question was maybe a bit more about whether it was going to be just the US or maybe some other neighbors as well. So I think that should be announced fairly soon, if I'm not wrong.
So, that 400 million is a big ticket. In terms of evaluating the level of payment, normally when we look at these deals, when we try to decide who's done well, whether the buyer, the seller has done well, we look at benchmarks. For the rights to the Women's World Cup in the US, do we have any benchmarks to go on that we can compare this with, or we can make a like-by-like comparison, say it's gone up by this much or it's gone down by this much?
So we can't really compare apples to apples here because this is the first standalone deal for the Women's World Cup in the US. All previous deals have been bundled in with the men's. So previously, the English language rights for men's and women's World Cups were held by Fox since 2014. Their first deal included the 2018 and 2022 men's World Cups, and then that also encompassed the 2019 women's tournament. And then it extended its deal to cover the 2026 edition and therefore also got the 2023 Women's World Cup. And so for that latest 2026 deal, which includes the 23 tournament, Fox is paying around $300 million for the rights, as well as a $180 million bonus for the US hosting it next year. And then the Spanish language rights were held by NBC Universal-owned Telemundo, which is paying around $350 million for its rights, and then $150 million in the hosting bonus. So including the bonuses, those rights are worth $945 million for one men's and one women's tournament. So we understand from the market that Netflix's deal is worth, a lot more money than was previously allocated for the women's tournament in those previous deals. What we don't know that exact value, but most of that value sat with the men's tournament in previous deals, which has been sort of the case when the women's tournament has been bundled in there. And, the 2023 Women's World Cup drew relatively low ratings, but that was partly because of the time zone, because it was hosted in Australia, and then partly because the US women saw a pretty early exit, was a bit unlike them because they did tend to do pretty well. And so for Team USA games, viewing got to as high as 6 million or 8 million per game. And then the final came in at 2 million on average for combined Fox and Telemundo viewership.
I mean, my perception has been and is that the women's team, the US women's team, has always been stronger than the men's team. It's always amongst the best 2 or 3 in the world at any given time. So you would assume, obviously, it's down the road. We don't know the qualifiers for either competition yet, apart from Brazil as the hosts. You would assume that the US women's team will be in there in both competitions, and that'll be an important factor. From what you're saying, it doesn't necessarily translate into a big difference in viewing figures. The men's World Cup, I mean, this is also what I seem to have read in the past, that the viewing figures in the US for the men's World Cup tend to be bigger, much bigger than for women's cup, irrespective of how the national teams are performing. I mean, is that tally with what you've seen in terms of ratings?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, those 23 numbers, they weren't, that bad in the grand scheme of things. But when you look at the men's tournament in the US in 2022, it drew a really large audience. Combined, Fox and Telemundo had 22.3 million viewers for the final. And the tournament overall averaged around 3.6 million per match on Fox and about 2.6 on Telemundo, but that's all matches. And Team USA last match before its exit from the tournament against the Netherlands drew an average of 12.9 million. So, if you look at those viewership numbers, you can sort of begin to infer what kind of allocation was given within the previous bundle deals for the men's and women's tournaments.
And trying to interpret this deal, I mean, it may be inappropriate to compare the men's and women's competitions, but I think we always have to look around for benchmark to make sense of these things. It strikes me, even though we can't separate out the previous value for the women's competition, if we just look at the total value of those two competitions and the value of this new deal, it strikes me that the differential between what Netflix is paying compared to what's been paid in the past is not that enormous. I mean, my feeling is that they're paying a really high fee, that this is a really good deal for FIFA. Is that the sense in the market that FIFA's done a really good job getting this level of income?
Yeah, I think so. And, I'd heard from the market that, that even kind of FIFA were surprised by how much Netflix was willing to bid and how much Netflix was willing to pay, because from what we understand, when FIFA first went to market, first they were looking for pretty much just the 27 tournament, and then any bidders could also bid for 31. But they were looking for around 130 million for that 2027 tournament. That was their target, not even kind of maybe the most kind of, this is what we think we'll get. This is what we want. If you look at that compared to what they got, that's pretty big number.
So 130 was their target for 2027. And at the time, when they first went to market, that was the only thing that was available. But you could also bid for 2031 if you wanted to. So basically, does that imply that across the 400, there's likely to be much more value in the 2031 tournament because of the US hosting, that there's a big premium attached to that?
Yeah, you would assume. I think also from kind of speaking to the market, I'm getting the sense that maybe it was not explicitly said in the contract, this deal is worth more because the US will be hosting it, also because nothing had been formally announced. But it was sort of a mutually understood thing when those discussions were happening that is what the picture was looking like.
Okay, interesting. So, I mean, that's a fantastic deal for 2027. Do we have updated picture of how FIFA is doing generally for the income for the media rights sales for the 27 World Cup?
So we've still yet to see how deals in some of the other markets play out financially for that 2027 tournament and then for 2031 as well. But we can already see that there is some more, if I can say, smooth sailing for FIFA this time around. That 2023 World Cup was plagued by a challenging time zone and an even more challenging media rights sales process, a bit of a standoff there between FIFA and the Big Five markets, which led to actually the EBU having to step in. And I've spoken to the market, starting to speak to the market about a few more deals that have been announced, including Sweden with TV4 and SVT, and then in the UK with BBC and ITV. And it seems like, knock on wood, I suppose, that the process is going a lot smoother so far compared to this last time around. I think There are generally more even expectations on all sides about the media rights process and the picture in general and kind of what the goals are. But we'll have to wait and see what some of those other numbers are looking like for FIFA as we report on other deals for the cycle.
So, as things stand, the way it's heading, your expectation would be that once all the deals have been completed, that the FIFA will come out with a much better figure for 2027 compared to 23 total value for media.
I mean, I would think so. And I think I'm just saying that because, the women's game is growing so much that a lot changes in 4 years. A lot changes between 2023 and 27 and then 31. So I think kind of as those every 4 years go by, I think it'll be growing more and more. But I think it's just more important to have sort of measured expectations and kind of not ask for too much before really the game is where that's at.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem to me that Netflix has been absolutely determined to get hold of these rights, and I suspect that the US hosting is probably a major factor in that, and also, the Brazil time zone. Just to go back to the beginning, you've mentioned a couple of aspects of how the process went. Take us back to the beginning, the timings, when the rights came to market, who the runners and riders were, what the expectations were, because I'm interested in how we got to this situation where Netflix is a completely new player for the Women's World Cup will be exclusive, I imagine, across the two tournaments, which will be, it's quite an interesting moment in the evolution of sports broadcasting for the United States. Take us back to the beginning. How did we get to this point where Netflix has walked away with the exclusive rights to two competitions in that territory?
Going back to the beginning, FIFA went to market with those rights, again, emphasizing for the first time selling standalone women's rights to the FIFA World Cup. They went to market with an invitation to tender on November 3rd of last year, of 2024. And initially, like I said, they were just looking to sell the 27 tournament, and then they gave broadcasters the option to submit a separate bid for 2031. And broadcasters could submit offers for either the English language, the Spanish language, or both together, which is what Netflix did. And we understand that FIFA executives were in New York mid-November last year to meet with the market and potential rights holders ahead of that December 3rd deadline for the ITT. And then FIFA also worked with the Octagon agency, which was advising them on the market. We understand that Octagon didn't actually do the deal itself. FIFA did that directly, but Octagon was kind of advising them on strategy and kind of what the market was looking like. And from what we understand, like I said, FIFA was asking or looking for around $130 million for that 27 tournament. And then if you think maybe 260 total, if you just double that, though obviously that's a bit different because the US is hosting in 31. And we understand that Fox, which, like I said, held the rights before, bid. NBC Universal also did bid on behalf of Telemundo for the Spanish language rights. CBS, we understand, also expressed some interest. And ESPN, which held rights before Fox did, so up until 2014, they did not bid. And from what we understand, all those other traditional broadcasting bids were closer to what FIFA was asking for, and obviously much lower than Netflix's bids or what the final number ended up being. And so they completely blew any competition out of the water there and just made a massive bid. And I understand from having spoken to the market that the property does not massively move the needle for a lot of those traditional broadcasters. Someone like Fox and CBS, they don't need the Women's World Cup. It won't change too much for their numbers or advertising. It's not a must-have for them. Netflix obviously is in a bit of a different situation here, much like the other streamers who are sort of finding their way within live sports and sort of trying to understand what's right for them. So a bit of a different place.
I mean, that's interesting to me because I would have expected, especially given the fact it's the US, given that we're coming off the back of the 2026 Men's World Cup, I would have expected it to be a moment of when there was really intense competition. So I'm kind of surprised to hear that Netflix blew everybody away. I mean, obviously the figure they'd put down was pretty colossal compared to the asking price and the other bids. So, I mean, what does this tell us about where Netflix is? I mean, I have to be honest, when it comes to Silicon Valley and these new tech players, the streamers, and sport, my view is that anything they say publicly about this is our strategy about sport, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. Not because they're being deceptive or anything like that. But the other thing that they always say publicly is that, we're very nimble. The thing you always hear about these Silicon Valley companies is that they're incredibly nimble, that they can pivot quickly according to changing market conditions, according to changing consumer habits. So when any of these companies say, this is our view on sport, my reaction is, okay, this is your view on sport today, but it might not be your view on sport next month. And take Netflix just as one example. I mean, pretty sure going back a few years, there were statements from senior Netflix executives saying, we're not going to buy sport. And then it seemed to be, okay, well, we might buy sport, but it's going to be just this kind of thing. And okay, we'll get into live sport, but it will only be this kind of event. And my view of Netflix is that their position on sports is evolving and is still evolving. And this represents probably another step, a major global football competition, 2 editions of the World Cup, a lot of inventory, a lot of games, okay, spread over a relatively short time period. That's quite a long premise to try to get to my question, which is this. On the basis either of public pronouncements by Netflix or on the basis of what we're seeing them buying, how would you describe Netflix's strategy regarding sports rights as it stands today?
So, as we've seen from Netflix and have heard from them as well on records, they're not yet, at least, looking to get into season-long sports content. That requires large investments, not just into rights fees and promotion, but also production capability. And that's just something that Netflix doesn't have, or at least doesn't have yet. The thing that Netflix wants at the moment is to increase its subscriber numbers, reduce churn, and that is part of the reason for its recent live sports plays. And its leadership previously has said that it hasn't, quote, been able to figure out how to deliver profits in renting big league sports in our subscription model. And that was said by Netflix leadership in January of 2023. In January of this year, the company said that while it is indeed trying to broaden its programming, full season big league sports are very challenging. And they said that, as opposed to sports, live events business is where Netflix really wants to be. And that sort of shows some of the strategy behind this acquisition. Netflix wants to own a moment in the sports calendar. The Women's World Cup is a really good way to do that. There's a lot of opportunities around storytelling. It's just one summer, or rather one summer every 4 years. It's a much smaller undertaking in terms of the bigger picture than, say, an entire season of the NWSL, if you want to follow the women's football analogy here. And while they haven't fully changed their stance entirely, you can kind of see, like you said, Frank, that they're slowly inching more and more towards pure live sport. It all started, with some experiments. They had the Netflix Slam for tennis and the Netflix Cup for golf in 2023, and then the Jake Paul and Mike Tyson fight last year. And there were some technical difficulties with some of those. And that's, I think, all part of the strategy, I think, just to iron out the kinks before kind of going, not full speed ahead, but speeding up. And then there were Netflix's biggest sports plays to date. So its global WWE deal for 10 years, and then the NFL Christmas Day games for 3 years. To compare those numbers and the Women's World Cup fee, Netflix is paying around $500 million per year in its 10-year global WWE deal, and then reportedly paying just under $150 million per game for NFL Christmas Day games. And so if you consider where the NFL is in sports media in the pecking order and where WWE is, that Women's World Cup number looks really strong. And obviously women's football is growing and quite quickly, but we can all acknowledge that, the fees for it in general are obviously quite behind some of the highest in the sports media world. And to talk a little bit more about their strategy, you can kind of see that all of those are live events. It's an opportunity to be the talk of the town for a couple of days or a couple of weeks for people to kind of say, oh, okay, Netflix is doing this sort of thing now. And it's to create new subscribers who then kind of stick around to watch a few more movies or TV shows, And the Women's World Cup acquisition, I think, fits broadly into that category.
I have a suspicion that the things that they say publicly is a kind of retrospective justification of the business they've done and is not a brilliantly reliable guide to what they're going to do in future. And I mean, the reason I say that is you mentioned that quote about not getting into season-long sports competitions. I'm fairly certain, I mean, I can't prove this, but I'm fairly certain that they were at the table when Formula One was selling its US rights, the ones that ended up going to Apple. So I don't know whether that involved a concrete bid. Now, obviously, Netflix and Formula One, there's a slightly different relationship because of the phenomenal success that they've had with Drive to Survive. I mean, Formula One is a season-long sports competition, and they were in there. They were seriously at the table. And, had they come away with the rights in the US to Formula One, they would now be saying, well, our sports policy is actually this. So anyway, I go back to my original point. I take it all with a pinch of salt. I think it's more interesting to look at the deals that they've done. And I mean, looking at that, the Formula One, as we know, in the end went to Apple quite recently, starting from next season. Now we've seen the Women's World Cup going to Netflix. These are big ticket deals, that they are major properties. and they're going exclusively over to streaming. Are there any takeaways if we look at some of the recent business that's been done? Are there any takeaways about the US rights market for sports as a whole? I mean, either in terms of the relationship between legacy players and digital players, or generally about the health of the market, say vis-a-vis the rest of the world, which, our perception, I think most people's perception is Europe is very difficult. Asia is very difficult. You look around the world for growth, it's difficult to find it. The US, my perception is that they are bucking the trend. So I just wondered, just to close off, are there any lessons here for us in this deal about the US, about digital versus legacy and all of those bigger pictures?
I think, especially for the big properties in the US, rights fees have been going up regardless of whether it's a streaming deal or not. The NFL, the NBA, the big leagues, all the numbers are going up. And as I mentioned, you see traditional broadcasters, they're also expanding their streaming capabilities in the meantime. Amazon Prime Video came in really strong with its acquisition of the NBA package, which also gave it global rights. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in the market. And, I think there's two things happening simultaneously. One is broadcasters are faced with more pressure than ever to retain and deliver on major sports rights, which drives up the price. And then at the same time, traditional broadcasters are faced with competition from streamers. And streamers are fighting for a piece of the pie as they're looking to grow revenue and see live sports as an important opportunity. But I don't think this is a US phenomenon. Obviously, we see the UEFA relevant UC3 global package that's positioned for the streaming bidder. And you see someone like Amazon come in for some Champions League games, in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. You see someone like Disney that's utilizing Disney Plus a lot more abroad for live sport. And so I think the US is just an outlier purely because of how concentrated the market is, with streamers and broadcasters and just how big rights values are there. Everything is just bigger in the US. I always say it's kind of like monopoly money, just because it's unbelievably large figures. You kind of forget, or at least I do, that these are real dollars that we're talking about when you're just kind of writing and talking about these numbers day in, day out. And I said this in one of our previous podcasts, but I think there's a lot more questions and answers in general about kind of streamers versus traditional broadcasters, especially with so much market consolidation, cord cutting, the struggles of RSNs and things like that. So I think we'll have to wait and see how this shakes out.
Good. Well, I think that's a great point to leave it on. Good way to round off. So thank you for that, Maria. Thank you for insights, and speak to you again fairly soon. And for everybody who's following, thank you very much indeed for your attention. If you want to find out more about sports media deals, or if you want to access the world's biggest database of sports media rights deal information, you can either have a look at the Sport Business website or email info@sportbusiness.com. So thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.